Hello. Well, good afternoon, friends. My name is Dinesh Soona. I work for the World Council of Churches. I coordinate a program called the Ecumenical Water Network. Effectively, that's the Water Justice Ministry of World Council of Churches. And along with the Anglican Communion, the World Council of Churches is hosting this joint event at the Faith Pavilion. And we are very happy that you all have gathered here. And let me also remind you all today that 10th December, of course, is the Human Rights Day. And this year is important because it's 75th year anniversary of the Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But also today at the COP context, it is the Water Day, the Food Day, and the Agriculture Day. And that's why it's important that we, while talking about climate change, we do not talk only in abstract or only in the rising temperature or sea level rising, but how this is actually impacting the various components that it gets aggravated because of climate change, such as the nexus of food, water, and people's livelihood, health, etc. Friends, let me also then briefly share a couple of key messages that why we are trying to do this. As I mentioned, that climate change cannot be addressed in isolation, and therefore a nexus approach only makes it holistic, and it can have many other actors could come and join hands while addressing climate change. We would try to have different perspectives heard today on in this discourse. So we have a faith perspective in the Faith Pavilion. Obviously, you can't miss that. The faith perspective on climate action. We also would have indigenous perspective, because we know that the indigenous communities are the hardest hit in this scenario. Not just the impact of climate change, but in general when it comes to water, forest, agriculture, etc. Then we would have a practitioner's perspective, like what as faith communities we have been doing about it. That is also important. So we would be listening to some of the good practices as well as our speakers would speak. And what are some key takeaways or the messages that the organizers wanted? I also wanted to just highlight, and then we'll see whether we met them. So we would like to look at some of the actions, because this is about climate action, how faith communities are mobilizing climate action. And we would therefore highlight some of them. We would also focus on evidence-based advocacy. We do not talk in abstract, but evidence-based advocacy that the faith communities are engaged in. And finally, faith communities are key partners of the multi-stakeholders with civil society organizations, with governments, and we would have several opportunities to relate to our work with these stakeholders. So with these few introductory remarks, I would acknowledge the presence of the three speakers that are here. I will introduce them a little later as they speak. We would have, I'll start from my extreme left, Archbishop Julio Murray. He is not new to this Faith Pavilion here, or not to the community. He has been speaking, maybe it's his third or fourth time here. Welcome, Bishop Murray. We have Jacobed from Panama. Archbishop Julio also comes from Panama. And then she's an indigenous activist, and she would also speak the indigenous perspective. And we have Nicholas Pandey, who would be talking about the practitioner's perspective from the Anglican Communion's point of view. And to set us all up, so welcome all three of you. And we have the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Right to Water and Sanitation. Unfortunately, he could not join us live, but he has sent a video message, and we would request now to the IT team to play the video message. And just before that, I also wanted to introduce that Professor Pedro Arroyo Agudo. He comes from Spain, and a Spanish parliamentarian. And since 2021, he has taken this role of United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Right to Water and Sanitation. So we can play the video now, please. Thank you.
Dear friends, first of all, thank you for your invitation, but above all, thank you for your incorruptible commitment and your fight for sustainability and environmental and climate justice from a human rights approach. In the framework, in this case, of a new coup with the wings of hope loaded with lead. I always insist that water is the blue soul of life, and rivers and aquatic ecosystems are the veins and arteries that articulate life on islands and continents, thanks to the solar energy that manages the climate. In 2023, I dedicated one of my 2 annual thematic reports to the challenge of making peace with our rivers and aquatic ecosystems, especially in the current climate change framework. If we are really to make progress on SDG 6 and thus secure the human rights to safe drinking water by 2030 for the 2 billion people without guaranteed access to it. In this report, I reflect on the convergence of the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, especially among the poorest, with the human right to a healthy and sustainable environment, and in particular to living and healthy rivers, lakes and aquifers on which the survival of these 2 billion people depends. For 2024, one of my reports focuses on the confluence of the human rights to safe drinking water and food, under the strict linkage to the human right to a healthy and sustainable environment. Those who defend the logic of the market as the solution for all problems promote the intensification of food production using the concept of food sufficiency based on the blind trust that markets will deliver it to hungry people. This approach comes even to justify aggravating the biodiversity crisis, the progressive impoverishment of soils, and in particular the overexploitation and pollution of rivers and aquifers. The impacts of the climate crisis itself are used even to justify the intensification of food production and trade, marginalizing any critical reflection on the increased emissions, the destruction of rural fabrics, and the unsustainability of aquatic ecosystems that such a strategy implies. However, according to FAO estimates, 70% of the food produced is thrown away, while 811 million people go hungry, and some 2 billion suffer from health problems due to being overweight. But in addition, and this is, in my opinion, the most worrying aspect, we are breaking the sustainability of our aquatic ecosystems, degrading the regeneration of soil fertility, triggering its salinization and erosion, and ruining fishing due to the unsustainable growth of irrigation, massive pollution, deforestation processes, poor agricultural and livestock practices, and the degradation and breakdown of the sustainability of aquatic ecosystems. Just as the human right to drinking water and sanitation, especially of the poorest, depend directly on the good state of the rivers, aquifers, and aquatic ecosystems that supply them, the human right to food of these same communities depends on the good state of the aquatic ecosystems that sustain their agricultural, livestock, and fishing production on which their food sovereignty depends. The challenge is and doubly complex. In addition to guaranteeing the food sovereignty of indigenous peoples and rural communities, it is necessary to move towards healthy diets, preserve biodiversity and fisheries, enhance productive diversity with native seeds and species adapted to each territory. But in my opinion, above all, and in particular, it is necessary to ensure sustainable management of aquatic ecosystems and soil fertility as key to guaranteeing the human right to food, as in fact the FAO itself is beginning to recognize. Addressing this challenge in the context of ongoing climate change must lead us, on the one hand, to consider the important consequences of food production and distribution strategies in the context of mitigation strategies, insofar as a significant percentage of CO2 emissions depend on it. In fact, present in the current context, livestock farming emits more than 14% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, while agriculture is responsible for 30%. This is why mitigation strategies based on the energy transition must pay more attention to food production and consumption strategies. On the other hand, and this is important, climate change adaptation strategies are essential to minimize the impacts of climate change both on water and sanitation services and on food production and effective access for communities living in poverty and vulnerability. Restoring aquatic ecosystems, especially wetlands, riverbanks, and aquifers, with a natural storage and fluid attenuation capacity, is essential to reduce the impact of droughts and floods, both on the human rights to safe drinking water and food, and to adequate housing and security. This is why it is also necessary to put adaptation strategies at the forefront as a key issue when it comes to adopting a human rights approach to climate change, minimizing the risks and impacts on populations in situations of greater vulnerability and extreme water-related events. Therefore, in my opinion, these adaptation strategies should be guided by what I call the hydrological transition. I would therefore like to end by thanking you once again and congratulating you for focusing your efforts and reflections on this triangle of water, food, and climate change in perfect harmony with the priorities guiding my thematic reports for 2023 and 2024. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that was Professor Pedro Arroyo, the UN Special Rapporteur for Right to Water. And he highlighted that 2 billion people around the world do not have access to clean water. And he also linked how about 70% of water goes into agriculture, food production, but 1/3 of the food produced gets wasted, and therefore that much of water gets wasted. Talked about the food sovereignty of particularly for the indigenous people, and he also highlighted in the mitigation and adaptation strategy how food systems and the hydrological transitions could be taken into account. So maybe some food for thought for our other speakers to come next. And if you have any questions to Professor Pedro, we could only send it by email because he's not joining us by live. Okay, friends, now let's move with this sort of a good premise given by Pedro. Let's take different perspective, and therefore first we would have a faith perspective brought to us by Archbishop Julio Murray, who is the bishop of the Anglican Church in Panama. As I mentioned, he has been the former primate of the region. And he has been actively engaged with the governments also, particularly in the biennial, the high-level dialogue for the biennial pact. And he has been the president of the interfaith committees, ecumenical interfaith committees representing the Anglican Communion, also actively engaged with the Anglican Communion Environment Network. And he also had chaired the one of the different phases of the Lambeth Conference in the past. And Bishop doesn't just now today wearing the Anglican hat, but he's also wearing the WCC hat. He has been recently elected as the moderator of the World Council of Churches Commission on Climate Change and Sustainable Development. So quite a responsible position Bishop Murray holds. So welcome, Bishop. If I may ask you to a couple of questions, and then if you respond, that will be a nice way of conversation.
Sure.
And since you're bringing the faith perspective, let me just ask a simple question. Why should faith community engage in the discourses on climate change? And if you have any, say, good practices, either you or your colleagues could guide us to.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate at this level in this panel. And thank you for the question in terms of why faith communities engage in this discourse, especially addressing climate change. I would like to share the perspective that comes from the Anglican Communion. And I would like to say that, first of all, it's a response that is coming from hope. We are, as I think and I have shared before, we are a resurrected people. We have heard the frustration, we have heard the reality of not recovering from one catastrophe and facing another in the different communities, the people that are at the grassroots. And I think then how important it is for us to help them reimagine what hope is all about and let them get the feeling that they are not in this all by themselves. It's a matter of hope, reimagining hope. And as you reimagine hope, your faith comes into action. We are a people of faith as well. Faith in the God of many names, a God that has promised not to abandon us, to be with us always, and even in the midst of suffering, God is present. So it's a combination of hope linked with faith. It's also a matter of justice. And justice, as we define it, it's a call to the parties to respond with urgency, with ambition, with interest. We understand justice as acting in ways that are based on principles of law, moral, fairness, and most of all, equity. God is the ultimate source of justice, and we honor God when we act on these principles along with our brothers and sisters. And the next thing that faith organizations bring to the table is the fact that we echo the voice of the most vulnerable when we make the most vulnerable the priority, because they have been taken away the opportunity and the power to claim for themselves. We act on their behalf to articulate the spaces where they can be present with their voice, with their face, and in the places where decisions are made. So faith organizations are articulators of hope and justice, and also to speak on the behalf of those who are the most directly affected by climate change. Then, to leave you with some examples of some of the things that have been happening, I want to share with you that member churches in the Anglican Communion are adopting policies and practices that are reducing the use of carbon-based energy sources and increasing of renewable energy source. Some churches, like the Anglican Church in Wales, the Church in England, the Anglican Church in Canada, they are implementing net zero strategies. I also want to share that the Church of England has divested from fossil fuel companies, while a majority are increasing their carbon sinks through nature-based solutions of tree growing and ecosystem conservation, especially the tree growing. The Communion has identified a wonderful project as the Communion Forest. And the examples are in the Anglican Church of Kenya, the Episcopal Church in Philippines, the Anglican Church in Brazil, and also the Church of Southern Africa. Now, if I switch and put on my World Council of Churches hat, there's also an opportunity to identify some clear actions when the World Council of Churches has announced it wants to cast out its bottled water and has joined the Blue Communities Project. The Blue Communities Project is launched tap-based public water fountains at the Geneva Ecumenical Center along with its leaders. That's one thing that's very important. Also, the Lutheran pastor campaigning for climate justice for the World Council of Churches has spoken at the conference in Paris, calling for worldwide divestment from fossil fuels for the sake of planet Earth. I also think it's very important to mention the World Council of Churches campaign on the 10 Commandments for food, and I am sure that our moderator can share a little bit more about that as well. But I think that in the same way, I can ask my colleague Nicholas, when he is making his presentation, to share other concrete actions that have been done in order that we will have more examples to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Yes, thank you. An applaud is in order. Bishop has highlighted that faith communities bring hope, justice, and voice and solidarity with the vulnerable community. Bishop has highlighted several policy engagement from the Anglican Communion as such, and the strategies to combat climate change, namely divestment from fossil fuels to initiatives of common communion of forest and the net zero strategy, etc., and also the World Council of Churches, Blue Community, the 10 Commandments for food, and also divestment from fossil fuel. So thank you so much, Bishop. We would have some opportunity for exchange afterwards. We will come back to you. And maybe at this time, let me look up to my indigenous people's representative here, Jochebed Solano. She also comes from Panama, from the Gunadul Nation, an indigenous people which are one of the 7 original ethnic groups in Panama. She is the co-director of the Memoria Indigenia and a missionary with the United World Mission. Her work consists of walking and learning from indigenous peoples, facilitating different processes of dialogues with the indigenous peoples, and telling different narratives and memories of the indigenous peoples' engagement. There is a bit longer introduction, but I would stop there. But also to add, Jochebed is also a member of the WCC's reference group on indigenous peoples group. So, Jochebed, then let me also ask you a couple of questions. Maybe if you try to respond briefly. Indigenous people, we know, are the protectors of nature and defend the waters, the forest, the land. But more often the corporations and the governments also victimize them, and at times even blame them for a little bit of their livelihood-related access to forest products, etc. So also the indigenous wisdom, whether is supporting the climate science or is it opposed to climate science. Maybe some of these concerns, if you can throw some light on that, please. You can use this microphone.
Thank you, moderator. Well, first, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk a little more about indigenous worldview. In Spanish, we call cosmovivencia, but I don't have this word in English. It's like how we live in the cosmos, because the approach is different when we think about worldview and how we live in the cosmos. Thank you for the question. I think it's very important, the question. One of the things I want to say, in my people, Kuna people, when we thinking about poverty, we don't think about poverty like a Western culture. Because for us, poverty is come from when people cannot relate very close with the land and earth. And my people say, we are poverty as a Kuna people if we cannot cultivate in our land. We are poverty if we cannot read the sign of the climate, of weather, or the Mother Earth. We are poverty when we do not care the Mother Earth. And that perspective is very important when we're thinking about what is the contribution of indigenous people in this topic and other topics, and we're talking about food sovereignty, because the perspectives come from very different in other worldview and in other perspectives and other wisdom. About the contribution for indigenous people to knowledge and how we can work together to scientists is very important, because sometimes many scientists don't call the indigenous knowledge like a science. They say this is like a knowledge. And that is not true, because, you know, the majority of the scientists today, they come from with the plants and the earth. And the indigenous people know very well how the earth is working in this moment. One of the things the indigenous community in Panama is doing, many centuries ago, we practiced Nainu. This is a Kuna word. It means how we cultivate the land. We use the land, and then we have to rest the land for 10 years. And that is, maybe you remember in the Bible too, about the jubileo, about jubilee. But that comes from indigenous knowledge. And then that's important, because when we wrote the land, we believe we have to rest the land, because it's not object, and we don't believe about resources. We say it's a gift come from God, from the Creator. It's another approach how we relate with the land and earth. Another thing when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, now many women, because we are today commemorate the indigenous woman, today we are thinking about how the indigenous women care the seed. We have a bank of seed. And that happened in many countries in South America and Latin America and Caribbean, because when we eat the food today, we just eat the food, but we have to remember who is care the seed. And we have the ban of seed. And today, the Kuna people working, because the climate change, it changes our season. We have in Panama dry and rainy season. And then, but sometimes in other contexts, when you are asking when is the season, they say, okay, now it's autumn, but now it's not really autumn. And that's happened for majority of us in our context. For Kuna Dule people and other indigenous people, they are working very close to know again what is the weather. And that is very scientific, because, you know, we have to know when is the good time to cultivate. Because in other moment, my ancestors cultivate in other moment. But in this moment, the woman and youth people making that, they say, okay, now it's not in the same. We have to remember when is the correct time. And that's important, how to continue work about indigenous knowledge as scientists. And now we are working about how we know what is the good place to cultivate. Because we have many indigenous youth people study at the university, the indigenous Kuna say we can work together with elders and intergenerational and youth people. And But the thing is, do not create epistemicide. What this means when the Western culture want to import their culture over the indigenous people. We have to work together. For Kuna people, that's important when we have many indigenous youth people working in the climate change actions, but they're at university, and they bring their knowledge, they bring their what they are doing in that university and working very close with elders. Finally, maybe I want to say about the elders always say to us, you can learn about Western culture. The thing is, don't forget where you come from. Don't forget our knowledge. I think that is very powerful if we can work together, but not really just we can include indigenous people in this process. Because for my people, my grandfather told me, when you go to university and you want to do some homework, sometimes you go to the Google. But for me, he say, I go to the forest. I know the seed, I know the plants. Because for us, the ancestor book is the plants. And I think the Kuna people know a lot about plants. And we have a lot of medicine for that. And then if we can work together, not steal the knowledge, but working together to deep in this knowledge, I think we can work together as human beings. And we are here as indigenous people in COP28 because we want to remember to the government the importance of the Mother Earth and our relation with the land.
Thank you very much. Let's give it a round of applause. Do not forget where you come from. That's a very powerful statement that would remain with me, at least. And the concept of seed banks, etc., that today are promoted, a long cherished indigenous practice. I think these are some of the reminders to those who would count out the indigenous wisdom and knowledge and not value it. So thank you for challenging, and hopefully we'll get some time for interaction as we move to the next panelist in our midst. That's from the Anglican Communion. Again, we have Nicholas Pandey, the permanent representative of the United Nations of the Anglican Communion. Is that the correct interpretation of yours? No. Oh, there you go. So that there is a mismatch. Sorry about that. The environmental policy lead for the Anglican Communion. Maybe you would soon get there. I almost took Martha's position. So anyway, but particularly you, Bishop Murray, mentioned about the communion forest, and you somewhat also lead about the communion forest systems. Maybe you probably find a little more time to tell us about what is this communion forest is about, even though Bishop Murray has already given some example. Also, I would request you to cite some examples in addition to what Bishop has already mentioned, what Anglican Communions is doing in addressing the climate justice issues, on food security, on sustainable agriculture, anything that can come to your mind in a short time of about 5-6 minutes, if you can help us understand your work.
Thank you, Dinesh. And I think just reflecting on climate frontliners, and as we talk about in our discussions this morning of mobilizing faith communities to act, and the Anglican Communion has been on the grounds with the communities who are at the front line of climate change, responding to issues in different ways. Communion Forest is our initiative largely on ecosystems, ecosystem conservation, protection, and restoration, which is on the climate mitigation side. But on climate adaptation as well, the Communion has been working with communities, probably giving examples of the vulnerable, what we call climate vulnerable communities. Those are communities largely in the developing countries. And we are talking about communities that are largely agrarian, communities that are depending mostly on small-scale agriculture to produce food and also to sustain their livelihoods. And in that context, maybe I'll just largely draw from my experiences in Kenyan communities. We find that these communities, because these are societies that are not yet food secure. So if today we are talking about the nexus of climate change with food, agriculture, and water, I mean, it's a very important nexus, because these are communities that are not yet secure, both in terms of food and water. Yet climate change comes to exacerbate that. Even before we started having more frequent droughts, which is one of the key impacts of climate change, like in communities like in Kenya, you already had food insecure communities who were not able to have food throughout, like be able to have 3 meals in a day throughout the year. So there is what in food security we call lean periods. Lean periods are the periods where it's the period between abundance and scarcity. So when communities, because they mostly produce in one season when you've got rain, so then they'll consume that food, and then it gets to a point just before the next harvest. That's a lean period. Mostly it used to be 2 months, largely between June and July. Those were like the lean periods. That's the point that if you entered most households, then people are either taking 1 meal or there was already an adaptation because of food insecurity. But when then now we talk about climate change exacerbating that, it means that like now Kenya is talking of 4 failed seasons, meaning that people are not able to produce food for 4 consecutive seasons. So you're not talking about just lean periods of 2 months between harvest and the next harvest. You're talking about total crop failure, and it's happening not in one season, but subsequent seasons. That becomes a huge challenge in terms of food security. And food security, talking about availability, access, utilization of that food. And the church has been having interventions in agriculture because, as I've mentioned, these are small-scale farmers who are largely farming for subsistence. And so some of the interventions that we've had is on providing climate information. So climate information is the development arm of the church in Kenya has been collaborating with government agencies, mostly the meteorological department. So what the program is that the meteorological department will give weather forecast, and so then use that weather forecast to develop advisories. So the advisories is what then we'll give to farmers. So if the forecast is that you're going to have below normal rainfall, so it means that you are we are interpreting that information from the technical language and be able to communicate it to the farmers so that they know how to plant this in the next season. So if the forecast shows that you're not going to have enough rainfall, so it means that you need to plant early maturing crops, because if you plant anything that is going to go beyond 3 months to mature, then you're going to have a crop failure. And such information we disseminate through the churches. We will give this information, or these advisories to the clergy. So because they've got weekly meetings, I mean, people come to church every week. So climate information is one of the areas in which we've had interventions. But we've also had interventions on small irrigation units. So this is where, because you are having, these are largely...
Sorry, we are running out of time, so probably
Yes.
wrap up.
All right, very quickly. So small irrigation is like small drip irrigation kits, especially for production on kitchen gardens, what we call kitchen gardens, for people to be able to produce leafy vegetables, because the dependence on rain has become challenging. And promotion of early maturing crops, as I've said, sensitizing communities to access seeds of those varieties that have been that are early maturing. And probably I will mention small stock, because especially for the pastoral communities, the men move away with with the livestock. And so they leave women and children back home. And so what we mostly support is that these households are able to have small stock like goats and sheep, that then the women are able to keep the nutrition of the family, especially through milk production. And in food looking generally, we've been also sensitizing communities and supporting communities to diversify their diets so that they embrace more indigenous foodstuffs, that they deal with issues of malnutrition for little children, especially in those times of drought and periods of scarcity, usually from food insecurity. So thank you.
Thank you, and sorry to rush you up because I'm seeing a sign there by the organizers, 5 minutes left. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing in responding to the successive crop failures in Kenya, and as in collaboration with the Met Department, how the churches are educating the farmers to better prepare for the worst, which is aggravated by climate change. Thank you so much. Friends, we got just about 3-4 minutes to take some comments, questions from those who are present. It would be a lost opportunity if we don't do that. And we take a couple of them and then we respond. Yes, and you can pass this microphone.
I come from the Zoroastrian Parsi community in India, and I've been listening to all these discussions about water and farming. And I'd like to say that we as a community are 0.601% of India's population, and we have a very strong farming community in India, basically growing crops and in particular fruits. One of the things I'd like to bring to the fore is that as Zoroastrians, we respect the waters and the earth. So we actually celebrate the birthday of the waters, we celebrate the birthday of the earth. So for example, the waters, the 10th day of each month we celebrate as the Day of Waters, and for the whole 8th month of our Zoroastrian calendar, we remember the waters. We have special prayers for the waters, and interestingly, we believe that at night the waters go to sleep, and therefore each morning the priest in the fire temple actually wakes up the waters, as it were, and to celebrate the beauty of the waters. And I think that if this kind of consciousness can be brought into farming, I can only tell you about the success of farming of my community and not the failures, etc. Because as a community, we're a very prosperous group of farmers, mainly with fruit crops that we grow. But I think if we begin to respect the earth, if we begin to respect the 7 creations that Zoroastrianism promotes, which is the skies, waters, earth, plant world, animal world, human beings, and fire, I think that there's great possibilities then of improving climate control, etc. If we recognize that each creation has its own sensitivity, and if we have special prayers for each of the 7 creations, which we do in the Zoroastrian tradition, which is one of the oldest revealed religions in the world, I think there's great hope for climate change and climate improvement.
Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing from your religious perspective how do you respect the various natural elements and how that sort of has a more sustainable interaction of how you live, and we are better prepared. So we, unfortunately, due to much of lack of time, we will not be able to take more questions from you. Anybody else? One more question or comment from here? If not, then we would have last words from each of our panelists. You have 1 minute to sum up what you wanted to tell the audience here again. We start with you, Bishop Julio.
Thanks again. I would like to just plant a seed, as a seed of hope one more time, because we believe in metanoia. We believe that there is a transformation that is needed in heart and mind, and about turning things around, seeing things differently, and seeing things anew. So if we accept the fact that we can be transformed, it will take us a long way in responding to climate change with climate justice. We are people of transformation as well.
Well, I would like to put other seat to follow my brother Julio about how we can, as a community of faith, we can stand together with indigenous people. Because in this moment we have a lot of statement and we call everyone to know more about what this is, what is this. And the other thing is to more about the indigenous knowledge. In your community, in your country, you can so welcome to continue listening and learning more about indigenous community, but this is some of the things we can do. Thank you.
Well, one of our ecumenical partners always have this strapline. They say that they follow Christ where need is greatest. And I think coming into this space is where we are bringing the voices of the people in climate frontline and acknowledging the importance of these conversations. I've been keenly following on the conversations on the global goal on adaptation, because all this that we are saying really need to be captured in that framework, that issues of food, agriculture, water, health needs to be captured with a robust framework that will be able to be resourced in a way that it will support these communities in the front line to secure their lives and their livelihoods. And I think that we would want, as people of faith, to advocate to our governments and to articulate that hope for the rest of the human community, and to push for action in a way that it will be responsive to the needs of the people in the climate front line.
Thank you so much. Planting a seed of metanoia, reconciling with a planet, and working with indigenous communities, and focus on this nexus of food, water, and climate, and be in solidarity with the frontliners. I think these are some of the last key messages that come from our three panelists. So thank you so much. And unfortunately, this is a very short time of 45 minutes, so we couldn't give much time to everyone. But thank you so much. I want to especially also thank the Anglican Communion, particularly I have to name Martha Jervis, the UN representative of Anglican Communion, not you yet. For the collaboration, and I want to also thank PARD, the Partnership of Religion in Development, for providing this opportunity to collaborate together. Thank you so much, and thanks, Miriam.